Hello everyone, and welcome to another one of my tabletop gaming lectures. I am Jason Bulmahn, game designer behind the Pathfinder role-playing game and director of game design at Paizo, and today what I'd like to talk to everyone about is how you break into games. How you go, from doodling your own maps and playing around with dice to actually, publishing your own game material, your own game systems, whatever you want. I think this is an important topic because I think there isn't really much of a structure to it. I think I get asked this question a lot. How do I break into games? Where do you start? How do you get going? And it's a hard question to answer because there isn't any one unified series of steps that you take. There isn't like a do this, then do this, then do this. Everyone who is in the game industry full-time has taken their own path to get there. As we move forward and as technology changes and as the industry itself changes, the number of ways that you can get into gaming continues to grow. And that's a good thing. For the longest time, there was really only kind of one narrow channel through which most people got a job. How you got to the entrance of that might be different, but there was still kind of some defined steps. But today, with the rise of indie publishers, small press, the big name publishers are still around, there's so many different ways that you can interact with the game, the tabletop game industry, that it really is good to just kind of take a step back, talk about it as a whole, and kind of give you some of the tools and tips to start your own journey. And mind you, this isn't just for making games. This could be for making supplements and adventures, to making worlds or settings. But, it could also involve making your own games or using one of the open engines to make a reskin of an existing game. So let's get started here. And to start out, we'll talk about what I like to call the common path. And if I'd given this lecture, 10, 15 years ago, this would have been the only path. It's not true anymore, but this was, for the longest time, considered the traditional way to get into gaming. And oftentimes when I'm asked to give a lecture about how to break into gaming, this is the lecture. This is all of it. There's a lot more to it now, so it's worth kind of expanding. But the most common way that folks have gotten into the game industry is it always starts out with like, oh, you're a game master, or you're a player at home, and you start by noodling around with little freelance projects or side things, right? You start very small. You pick up a little bit of writing from an open call. You write a handful of feats, maybe a monster. You write, some short adventure for a game system. It always starts off with really small projects. And basically, the point of those is to kind of establish that you can be trusted with bigger work. Establish yourself as someone who can follow instructions and deliver what is needed by the publisher to create the product they're trying to create. This is also about the point in time in the lecture where I always tell aspiring people, hey, don't quit your day job, right? The game industry isn't one that you go into to become rich. It's just not. You can make a living in gaming, but there are very few people who have truly struck gold in this industry. It's mostly a smaller cottage industry. So when you're starting out, it's good to have a stable work environment so that you can make ends meet and you're not trying to desperately sell PDFs to make rent. As that goes along, after you've been doing some freelance, the next step is usually to, get known and start building relationships in the industry itself. As I said, gaming is a very small industry. There are only a handful of tabletop game companies, and we all kind of know each other. And if you want to become a bigger presence in that industry, the first thing you got to do is get to know some of those folks, right? You have to kind of start making a name for yourself. And that starts by doing some freelance work. And then it continues by going to conventions and meeting the folk in person, establishing a rapport, having some meetings, talking about bigger projects. And that's kind of where you go from there. You start writing bigger projects. You get bigger portions of books. Maybe you get books to write all by yourself. And what you're doing at this point in time is slowly building a body of work, or a resume. And after you've done that for a period of time, that's when you would apply for full-time gigs. Now, I kind of follow this formula to a T almost. I had a job in architecture, but was a gamer full time in my off times. I started doing freelance work. I got a gig working for Organized Play. I was working for the Living Greyhawk campaign, and through that I was writing a whole bunch of scenarios and getting to know people in the industry. I would go to conventions and get to meet the various people at these companies, and eventually had a big enough resume that when an opening appeared at Wizards of the Coast, I applied. And I didn't get it. No, I ended up getting a job shortly thereafter with Paizo, working on Dragon Magazine. And through that, I built game design skills, and eventually, when it came time for us to make a game, I pitched Pathfinder. So I'm very traditional in that, right? I think many folk who are in the game industry, and I say many, not most, I say many because it's by no means all, have some similar tale of starting with freelance, getting to know folk, and applying for a job. I think a good chunk of the folks who work in the Paizo creative department, that's how they got in. And there's nothing wrong with that. But I think there are some elements of that today aren't necessary. They are barriers that I think are more about companies and the way companies operate and the way it always has operated, that sort of institutional cruft of like, well, you have to earn your way in. I think while that is great at protecting companies, it's not the way for everyone. And, not everyone can afford to go to shows and build, rapport with people. I mean, right now there aren't even conventions to go to. So, but, I think those sorts of things do make it harder for some folk to break into the game industry. Especially when, if you're not, if you haven't been doing this since you were a kid, right? It can be a long road to hoe. So, it can be a challenge. The game industry is a cottage industry, and who matters. And making books on your own traditionally has been something that's very dangerous financially. Most game books have a razor-thin profit margin, and the distribution chain is kind of arcane, and there's barriers to getting your stuff in stores and getting stores to pick it up. And with that being the only game in town, you had to kind of work within the established system, and that established system favored some folk more than others. It was a problem, and it continues to be a problem. But as we have moved forward, there are more and more tools for other folk, for really kind of everyone, to get into game design. But before we get to that, let's sum up kind of the common path. Most folks find their own way into games. They start with freelance. They build up relationships with industry folk. They work on bigger projects. They assemble a resume. They apply for full-time positions. But it doesn't have to be that way anymore. It really doesn't. And this is kind of a newer part of this lecture. Normally, that was the lecture, but not anymore. Not anymore. So, I think what we are seeing right now is a changing landscape in games. I would say that over the past, 5 years or so, there have been so many developments, so many changes and evolutions to the way that elements of the game industry work, many of which are challenging the kind of status quo of things, that the whole industry itself is kind of opened up far wider than it ever has been in the past, which has thankfully led to a more diverse group of game designers and a broader variety of games with different viewpoints and different worldviews, which really is something special. There are a lot of really exciting games out there. Now, I don't want to undercut the folk who have been making, different games for decades, right? This isn't a new thing, but there has been a market uptick recently, especially with all of the new tools and technology that is available. And I want to go through some of that stuff so that you can understand kind of how many tools, how much there is at your disposal right now to help you make games. So, first of all, there's a lot of barriers to just kind of sitting down one day and saying, you know what, I want to make my own game products. And there's reach. How do you get the games out there? How do you get them in stores? There's a question of capital. How do you get the money to do it? Because it can be very expensive to print games, to pay for art, to pay for designers, to pay for graphic designers, to pay for editors. How do you communicate with your audience? How do you get the word out? All of this stuff traditionally has been a barrier. But again, things have really started to change. And it started perhaps with the rise of kind of digital games, I would say. And by that, I mean, PDF and digital distribution of game products. Stores like DriveThru and itch.io have really changed the way a game designer can access an audience, because you can get the product directly to them. There's no print time, there's no warehousing, there's no worry about overhead. This dramatically drives down the cost to make a game. It's mostly just done on computers at that point in time, and you just, bundle it up and put it up. And if there's a mistake, you can fix it, and it automatically gets updated to everyone. Like, there's so many advantages to that as a format, that it really does start to compete against traditional game book publishing in ways that I think has only continued to grow, especially in light of the current pandemic and the shuttering of a lot of game stores and whatnot. PDF and digital distribution is the only game in town to some extent. This also allows a creator to make a game and have it be very agile in the market, and in terms of patching up any mistakes or problems with it. This is a luxury that print publishers don't have. For me to make a game book and get it out to the public, I have to plan for 15 months or something, between outlining, writing, developing, editing. Some of that stuff doesn't change no matter what your end format is. But at the end, I still have, a 3 or 4 month window of print times, delivery times, and distribution that you can just chop right out if you're working purely digitally, which is pretty great. So that was kind of one of the earliest pieces. I think that came around, obviously the rise of the internet and everything, but I think DriveThru and whatnot really kind of came into its own in the past 10-ish years or so. Maybe 15, depending on where you're counting. So, but there's been a much bigger development, I think, more recently, and this is obvious, but the rise of crowdfunding has been a seismic game changer for the entire game industry. The ability to, as a creator, to directly access capital and have a direct pipeline to the customer, cutting out the publisher, cutting out the distributors, cutting out the game stores, just creator directly to end user that's night and day different, right? So if I wanted to make a game in the 90s, I had to pitch it. I had to convince a game company that it was something worth making, that there was a business sense for doing so, that it was worth investing all the money in. Then it had to be written, then it had to be printed, then it had to be picked up by distribution, it had to be ordered by game stores. All along the way, there are people who could say, nah, and now I have a failure on my hands. Crowdfunding says, nah, if you have a good idea and you can convince the audience that it's a good idea, you're there. You're there. There's no one in the way to stop you. You just have to convince the consumer that it's something that they want. So, this has made countless indie studios viable. Solo designers, have been popping up all over the place. And all of these folk are competing directly with the established powerhouses. I find it fascinating whenever last year when I was at, Gen Con and PAX Unplugged, the number of game companies that I had never heard of before because they had literally spawned out of crowdfunding and were just like, yep, we're a brand new game company. I have no knowledge of them. They're just proliferating everywhere. And that's a great thing because that means we get to see games that the kind of more traditional, cautious, established parts of the game industry would not make, because they would go, oh, I don't know. I don't know that there's enough audience for that. And that's not to say that they're being malicious about it. It's just, it is so challenging from a financial sense to spend all the money to make games. And if they don't do well, that could be the whole business. So, crowdfunding changed that entirely. It removed all the middlemen from the process. And that, in turn, to some extent, has contributed largely to the next point I want to make, which is the kind of current explosion of indie, the indie explosion. I think in the early 2000s, the entire game industry consolidated behind the D20 license. And that had its upsides. We were all playing the same game, but it had a lot of downsides too, in that the consumers at the end weren't really getting a wide variety of product. It was all D&D all the time, all D20 compatible. And as the industry kind of crested out of that, what happened was as the kind of bigger studios, us included, stuck with some derivation of that, you started to see more and more companies spring up whose sole purpose was to create some new indie game. So I would say that, that process started, 15 years ago, and it's only been, about 7, 8, 9 years, has really started to see some of these games get critical acclaim, get a lot of play out in, the industry spaces. If you look at books and games like Dread and Fiasco, these are hit games that have done very well for themselves. They have very large groups of fans who really enjoy playing them. But they are tiny little game books, right? These are things that if you had pushed that out in the 80s, I don't honestly think any of the larger publishing houses would have touched them at that point in time. You also have, learning from the D20 license, you have a lot of shared systems, things like Fate, and Powered by the Apocalypse, and game systems themselves that are basically being shared, where the back end of the game system is being shared, and then individuals will come along and skin the game or alter it to match their version, their view of what they want the game space to be, allowing them to build the kind of game and world without having to do the back end system work. I mean, at least not as much of it. the indie explosion has also been powered by print on demand and small run printing. There's been a lot of interesting developments in that, especially in the past 5 years. I think print on demand has gone from being something that most people went, I don't know, the quality is kind of iffy, to now you almost can't tell, and there are entire publishers whose catalog is entirely POD, and they might print a whole bunch of it and put it into distribution, but it's still a print on demand product. You can tell usually, because they usually have a control sheet in the back. But without that, you almost can't tell. Some of them really have gotten to the point where these sorts of kind of more boutique printing has become more and more common. I think, Drive-Thru obviously has some POD. You can even do POD like board games and stuff through like Game Crafter. There's a lot of interesting stuff going on there. It really is a constantly evolving landscape. I've really been personally fascinated with the growth of kind of zine games like Mothership and Goblinville and things like that are literally just tiny little flimsy booklets. They usually have really good graphic design because it's kind of an artistic work. They're usually pretty gorgeous, but they're tiny little books. They're like 36 pages. They're 4x6, and they're packed dense with text and rules and art. And to be honest, the zine games have existed for 40 years, but I think that there's been a really fascinating explosion of them lately, and these are almost all indie game designers who just want to get their game out there, who have a vision for a thing and want to get it out in the public. I've been eating them up. I've been picking up a lot of them because there are some really good stuff out there. So the point of all of this is to say that there are so many different avenues now to get into games, that as someone who is maybe giving it some thought, you don't have to take the common path anymore. You can, go to crowdfunding, you can do PDF printing, you can do boutique small run, you can do indie press, you can do, there's so many different ways now that you can get your ideas out there, that the traditional kind of method of building a resume and getting a full-time job isn't what you have to do anymore. Now you can do it all. You can design the game. You can get the capital to make them. You can put them out there for digital sale. You can even print them up. I've seen some of these zines are printed by hand by the person who made it. You can do as much or as little of that process as you have the desire or skill to do. And that the end result of that is a game industry that is wide open for new creators to come in and, get their game out there, get it in front of people's eyes, get them playing it, and really shake things up. And it's an exciting time to be a part of the game industry. So before I move on to part 3, in which I'm going to talk about a lot of my tools and kind of how I like to approach game design, let's go ahead and recap. So it's a changing landscape for the game industry. Developments over the past 10 to 20 years have made it easier than ever to break into games. There's been a rise of digital games. You don't need a publisher anymore. You can, create a PDF and put it up for sale yourself. The birth of crowdfunding has changed the landscape, giving you direct access to capital and your fans. It kind of is a built-in marketing campaign for your game, and that's something that has really caused every single person in the game industry to look at the creation methods in a new light. There's been an explosion in the indie market, growth of tools, and an overall acceptance of indie games. They used to kind of be something you really had to dig for, but now many game stores have an entire indie section where you can go and check out the smaller pressed games. It's really exciting stuff. So really, as a creator, you have all the tools of the game's actual production are now kind of easier than they've ever been. They really are. So let's move on to the third and final part of this. Before I open it up to chat, for those of you who are watching this on Twitch, we will, after this is done, we will be opening it up to Q&A. If you're watching this on YouTube, we stream every Saturday from 4 to 8. We start out at 4 with the lecture, and then after the lecture, we do some Q&A. I cut it off for YouTube because nobody watches it. So, but it is a lot of fun. So let's move on to the third and final step here, which is kind of the tools for design. Now, as I've mentioned, there isn't really one unified way to get into games. There isn't really a degree you can go get, to get you started. I mean, I have a degree in architecture. A lot of folks have degrees in some sort of science or English, like writing or, copy editing and stuff like that. There's plenty of degrees like that. But there really aren't very many universities that offer game design degrees. I'll put an asterisk on that because there actually are a few now, but many of them are focused on video games. Some do actually have a pretty decent focus on tabletop games now. That is a very, very new thing, but it is growing. It is growing. So what I'm saying is, no one in this industry is going to credentials check you. That I have never heard anybody during any process go, well, do you have a degree in game design? That's not a thing. No one has that. I mean, I have a degree in architecture, and I think I've worked with game designers who have had degrees in chemistry, philosophy, computer engineering. It's kind of all over the place. It really is. What I'm getting at is you really kind of have to teach yourself, to some extent. And so, like, I have a lot of books and tools that I use to further my own understanding of game design. I'm going to share a bunch of those with you all, right now. I've got a big pile of books, right around here that I'm going to show off some of my favorites. I don't want to give the impression that what I'm about to say is exhaustive, nor do I want to say that they are required. There's a lot of different ways you can learn about games, and you can, to be honest, just learn by trial and error. You can feel your way through it. I'm the type who likes a good book to read, who likes lessons, who likes going and digging into that. But that's not the only way to do this. But for those of you who are like me and would prefer some tools, we're gonna talk about some here right now. So I'm going to talk about game design books first, and these are purely game design books. Now, some of these are like designing adventures or things like that, but I will rapidly get into actual like mechanical design books. So the first thing I want to do is I want to show off the Kobold series of game design books. These are great. Wolfgang at Kobold Press has really assembled a fantastic guide, a series of guidebooks to talk about games. This one is plots and campaigns. There's a guide in here to world building, and a guide to magic, and a guide to combat, and a guide to game mastering, right? These are all great. These are all really good, and these are filled with essays and lectures from luminaries throughout the game design world. The one that I found the most useful in here actually is the Kobold's Guide to Board Game Design. I find this book to be fascinating. It has lectures by some of the industry's brightest folks. So yeah. Selinker, Ernst, Garfield, Steve Jackson, tons of good folk in here. Just giving essays and lectures about interesting things about game design. So those are fantastic. I highly recommend. I also then want to talk about these books are more like theory books. I've got a handful of these. Ugh. So there's a lot of these, and you can go to Amazon and find basically all of them. A few of these are brand new, so I'm not super familiar with them. I just got Uncertainty in Games, and this talks about how uncertainty is a critical component in game design and gameplay. Characteristics of games. This is more of a textbook. This one's quite good. Theory of Fun is a really entertaining read. I like this book quite a bit. And by Ralph Koster. This talks about puzzles, games, and actually goes into a lot about why we play games, how we play games. You will find as you dig through theory books that you are rapidly starting to get into books that not only talk about the how and whys of designing games, but they also start talking about, how we as people engage with games, how games are a really important part of development, how they're a really important part of our psyche, how games serve to teach us lessons, to examine ourselves, to examine our skills, to examine the world around us. Like, there's none in this pile, but I do have one or two game books on psychology as well that just kind of start talking about, how the mind works, right? Some of that is a part of game design. I also just recently picked up a book on gamification because it's kind of everywhere now and I want to learn more about it. So I then want to talk about one of my favorite game theory books. This one is my absolute favorite. This book is really a gem. It's not exactly cheap. It is a textbook style book, but this book by far is one of the most valuable game design books that I own. It is The Art of Game Design, a Book of Lenses by Jesse Schell. I almost said Schnell. But this book is fantastic. It is filled with what are called lenses, which are different ways you can look at your game. It's sometimes very useful when you're building a game to stop and look at it from different perspectives and different angles to analyze it for its weaknesses and its strengths. This book is fantastic at providing a wide variety of lenses through which you can analyze and examine your game. The lens of beauty, the lens of the story machine, the lens of, the crystal ball. I don't even think have I read this one? Yeah. So this book's fantastic. I highly recommend. I will include a link down below to a handful of these. But The Art of Game Design by Jesse Schell is a classic, and I highly recommend it if you want to get into game design. So there's also a lot of skill adjacent books, right? Like, being in game design isn't just about deciding what mechanics you want to make and what story you want to tell. That is certainly a critical component of it, but there's so much more than that. So there's a bunch of books that I like to call the kind of adjacent skill books. And these are things that you as a game designer may not tackle yourself. You may bring somebody else on to tackle. That's fine. But if you're trying to do it all yourself, there are a lot of books out there. So, one thing that you can look at are books that examine the UX, the user experience. And this is valuable in game design because understanding how your user is going to work with your game will allow you to make better games. So, some of these are really simple. They're really basic books, like 101 UX Principles. Each one of these is like a page or two. Many of them are not really very applicable to games, but many of them are, right? Dealing with how people interact with things. This is mostly about building websites, actually, but there's a lot of really good principles in here. Bottlenecks here is one that I'm still working through, so I don't have much to speak about it, but it does talk about psychology and UX. So that one's good. There are also books on graphic design. I think I didn't pull any of these out of my pile, but I do have some books on graphic design about the kind of elements of graphic design. If that's something you're going to be doing for your game, having an understanding of graphic design is really quite useful. Although, to be honest, this is an area where hiring a professional is really going to pay dividends because they've done all that work for you, and it is a lot. But as a game designer, you should also probably look into books on story and narrative design. I've got a handful of books that I use with some frequency. One of my favorites in most of these I've used recently in building larger storylines, building larger campaigns. Like when I was building Knights of Everflame plots, these books were at my side quite frequently. One of my favorites is Robin Law's Hamlet's Hit Points. This book examines how you can deconstruct story cycles into upbeats and downbeats, procedural beats, and things like that, so that you understand how your story is actually evolving. When you're building adventures, when you're building those parts of games, understanding how the human mind likes to engage with story content is really very useful, and this book does a great job on it. The Writer's Journey kind of examines the kind of mythic structure. Joseph Campbell's book is also useful. I have that around here somewhere. Although it is a little tired and a little overused, it's still good to know just so that you can identify it, because once you understand, how the mythic story works, you will see it everywhere. The hero's journey is in everything, and that's not a bad thing necessarily, except for when it's just kind of being relied on as a cheap trope. Understanding it so that you know how to subvert it and you know how to use it to your advantage is really quite useful. How many is Hamlet a rogue? No, he's not. But it the book in particular, Hamlet's Hit Points, deconstructs 3 stories: Hamlet, Dr. No, and Casablanca, and breaks them apart to understand their story structure, and does so while talking about games. So that's what it is. I also have a lovely book called Save the Cat, which is a book on screenwriting. RPGs aren't screenwriting, but understanding that story structure and how to make things pop and how to make things work is a part of game design. To some extent, but I consider that kind of an adjacency. I don't think it's something that everyone is going to need, and if you're just building your own games, I don't know how much that's useful. I would focus more on like the art of game design and things like that. I think there's a lot of other tools out there that are available to you that don't cost you anything. Everything I've put here are books that cost money. You can get them as PDFs in a lot of cases. You can get them for cheaper in that way. Unfortunately, The Art of Game Design is not a cheap book. It's like $60 or $70 depending on when you get it and where you get it from. So some of these can be a little bit more expensive, but that said, there are a lot of tools out there that are free or very easy to access. I highly recommend online, if you're on YouTube, checking out the GDC lectures. Many of their lectures go up on YouTube for free a year or two after they air, which means there is a vast library of GDC lectures. And if you're not in the know, that's the Game Developers Conference. It's mostly for folks making video games, but that has changed over the years, and it does have a broader base these days. So a lot of it's going to be things like, here's how we built the rigging. Here's my lecture on building cool rigging for AI monsters. Great. But they do have a number of lectures that talk about the theories of game, the theories of fun, and things like that. Some of those are gold. There are some great lectures in there that are definitely worth going and checking out. All of the lectures are given by people in the games industry, so you're learning from other folks who have already, had success, and they are more than happy to disassemble and examine how they got to where they are, and learning from them is pretty great. There is also a series called Extra Credits, and they did an entire series on games. There are dozens, if not hundreds, of videos in this series. Again, many of them will deal with video games, but a lot of them have much broader applications. One of the things you quickly learn once you start really digging into game design is that the way we classify games, oh, it's a video game, oh, it's a board game, oh, it's a role-playing game, that really mostly just speaks to what comes at the end and its final output. The theories behind the games, those are pretty universal. They're going to be applied differently. There's going to be some that are more applicable to some aspects of game design than others. But most of the theories, most of the thoughts, most of the learning behind game design really doesn't care as much about whether or not it's a video game or a board game or a card game. The principles of how humans interact with games, how we like to take and process games and play with them, those are pretty universal. And learning those, which you can do through some of these books, through some of these video lessons, is going to be your ticket to understanding how to build the game that you want to make. So finally, I want to say that the best way to learn how to make games is to learn by doing. It really is. I think, Pathfinder was by no means the first game I ever made. Not even close. Not even kind of close. When I was a kid, I was doodling games. When I was, a teen, I was writing my own stuff. When I was in college, I was running my own games and creating my own weird subsystems. You learn by doing. By creating games, by engaging, with the people who are playing them, by getting their feedback, by learning about what worked, what didn't work, what needs more work. This is the only way you grow. This is the only way you evolve. All of these books, all the lectures, all the tools to help you make games, all of that is just there to dance around this central premise that you have to start by making games and playing games. And that's not something that you need to spend years doing before you are ready to call yourself a game designer. Each and every one of us are kind of on our own journey of learning and exploration. Mine isn't done. I learn more every day about games, about what people like about them, what they don't like about them, and the amazing part about it is it changes over time. What people like about games is different today than it was 10 years ago, than it was 20 years ago. So you constantly have to be growing and evolving. And all of the best game designers that I have ever met in this field take that to heart. They are always playing more games. They are always learning new things about the game industry and games as a form of art, as a form of expression, as a hobby, and as an interest. So that's it. Get out there and do it. So let me wrap it up here. Tools for designers. There isn't one true way to make games. There really isn't. But teaching yourself is a fun and rewarding process. There's a lot of tools at your disposals. There's game design books like the Kobold Guides. I mentioned again the Art of Game Design. I'm going to put links to some of these down in the description of this video. There are skill adjacent books like things on UX design, graphic design, editing, story. The more of these the more you're going to be prepared to make good games. And it is funny how, becoming a better writer, even though fundamentally, you're as a designer, you want to be making fun and interesting games, but being a good technical writer is a part of that, because you have to be able to get your rules and your ideas across to the end user. If you don't do that, then you have to have somebody else do it, or it's confused and your game doesn't get across. So those sorts of things are useful. There's a lot of online lectures. You can go to the GDC lectures. There's the extra credit series. There are more. I grabbed those two because they are expansive and pretty deep. But yeah, there are also a bunch of podcasts on this as well. I myself have not dug too deeply into the game design podcast, but I know there are some out there. And finally, you can learn by just doing. Learn by making. That is the most rewarding way to do this. It takes time, it takes effort, it takes your energy, but you will get, the hands-on experience you need to, become a game designer. The moment you make your first game, you're a game designer. Congrats. I hereby dub thee game designer. There is no certificate. So, I think that about covers it. That is about everything. I want to thank you all for watching here today. This has been a fun lecture to give. As a reminder to folks, I do give these lectures every Saturday at 4 p.m. on my Twitch channel. They get loaded up to my YouTube the following Monday. So if you miss it on Saturday, you can catch it on Monday on YouTube. But if you want to participate in the Q&A, stop by the Twitch when it's all said and done, and we'll talk. We'll chat about it. You can pick my brain for things I may have missed. So that's it. Thank you for watching, everybody, and we will see you next time.